Recording continues. So this is still the same set of slides. This is still rendering part 1, but it's part 1B after the little homework break. All right, so now we move on to talking about a related... Oh, yeah, I need to put this freeze off. Hold on a sec. All right. Okay, now we continue to a related matter about rendering, but a bit more kind of background technical stuff. And that's frame buffers. So this is a bit more about how stuff works under the hood, which is worth knowing, turns out. So modern rendering systems are what's called raster-based, which means they draw pixel dots. They for example, there was an old system that was using asteroids back in the 70s that actually you drew lines directly. It's called vector graphics, which now describes a style, but back then vector graphics was actually a hardware system. It was a cathode ray tube that knew how to draw lines, and it actually built things out of lines, not out of pixels. But modern systems are all built out of pixels. They're called raster systems. What happens there is that before you get to see the image on the screen, it's actually built up internally inside a thing called a frame buffer, which is just a big block of memory. In fact, what tends to happen is the frame buffer is a block of memory that resides on your graphics card nowadays, which is specialized hardware to draw it and connect it to your display hardware and so on. But basically, it's just a blob of memory, and there's one entry per pixel in this blob of memory, and that's how you can control the exact color of every dot ultimately. Well, the way people often think about frame buffers is to imagine them as being a two-dimensional array of pixels, and that's a perfectly sensible way of looking at it. Ultimately, it's a contiguous thing. It's really like a one-dimensional array that's just got everything in it. But array dimensionality is a strange topic. When you're thinking in your head, you can think of it as a 2D array that's got an X index and a Y index, and you index into them to find each pixel. And ultimately, you can set the colors on each pixel individually. And what happens is that when your display hardware is ready to draw a new image to send it to your display device, it then scans through that buffer, reads out the memory values, interprets them as color signals, sends the color signals to the display, and it figures out how to draw stuff using your LCD or whatever. And that's how it all works. It turns out you can actually access this in Canvas. There's a thing called image data that basically lets you have a pixel level view of what's going on, so that you don't have to build things out entirely out of like lines and circles and rectangles. You can actually say, I want this dot at 33 pixels across and 78 down to be bright blue. And you can just set it exactly. So now you don't have access to the frame buffer in modern systems. The frame buffer is sort of protected memory. It lives on the graphics card, and also the operating system doesn't want you to do that, because if you had access to the frame buffer, you could draw stuff outside your window, so you could screw up other people's apps and everything. So you can usually not access the frame buffer directly, but the image data is basically a little copy of the part of it that you are allowed to touch that you can now manipulate. And that turns out to be quite useful, and there are indeed image data methods that let you do that kind of pixel level work. So they give you an array, and you can index into the array and do just what I described. And what happens when you do that, if you want to set a pixel, you probably know this already. You know that pixel colors are specified as having a red, green, and a blue component to them. Also, sometimes a thing called alpha, which is a way of describing transparency if you're layering images. But the end result is you get an RG and a B. And the higher level primitives that I just showed you for Canvas, like the arcs and the rectangles, ultimately that's what they do. Of course, they produce pixel level results, but they do it, in a way that is like actually probably more efficient than if you were to do it yourself by doing it pixel level, because they can take advantage of secret knowledge under the hood. But at the end of the day, they're writing stuff into the frame buffer array just like you are. So I mentioned RGB. Those are the primary colours that you'll probably know are used to construct the other colours that we see on display devices. Another quote from that play I mentioned, Rosencrantz. Does anyone know Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead? Yeah, okay. So it's quite a funny play written in the 60s, so it's even older than me. And it's a play that's set in the background of Hamlet. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are two minor characters in Hamlet, and this is basically Hamlet from their point of view. And it's got some quite funny ideas in it. And there's a weird line in it, one of a number of weird lines in it, where one of the characters says, "The colours red, blue, and green are real. The colour yellow is a mystical experience shared by everybody." Now, not quite sure exactly what that means, and I'm not sure if the characters do either, but there is actually a sense in which that's an interesting claim. What it's getting at is the idea that the red, green, and blue so-called primary colours, which turns out to be the ones that your eye is particularly adapted for, kind of, that they always have a kind of special status, and the other colours that we see are actually, we perceive them as combinations of the red, green, and blue, and that's how TVs and LCDs work. They generate the RGB sub-elements, which almost tricks your brain into seeing things that aren't technically there. So when you see yellow on a modern screen, you're not looking at pure spectral yellow light. You're actually looking at a mixture of, well, in fact, this diagram here, you're actually looking at this thing here that you think is yellow isn't really yellow in the truest sense. What it is an area where there's red and green next to each other, like very small, like pixel size, right? But really it's just reds and greens. But what happens is that your eye, when you stimulate the reds and the greens, that is what would have happened if it really had been yellow. Real yellow does exist out in the world, right? There's yellow light in the sky and stuff. And when the yellow light impinges on you, things of that wavelength, it turns out that your red and your green sensors both respond to it a little bit, even though it's not exactly red or green. So you tickle your red and the green sensors, and that's what yellow does to your eye. Therefore, if I just literally shine red and green at you, it makes you think you're seeing yellow, even though you're not. This is the amazing thing. People sometimes misunderstand this. They think that red plus green equals yellow. No, it doesn't. It doesn't change the wavelength of the light, right? You've got the red wavelength and the green wavelength, and that's all you've got. There isn't some magical spectral chemistry that occurs that changes the wavelength of the light and it becomes yellow. No, it doesn't. It's just that your eye can't tell the difference because your eye is stupid, or your brain is stupid, right? And that's why yellow is a mystical experience, because in a certain sense, we don't really see yellow, you know? It's a complicated idea. Anyway, you can read about primary colours if you like, but this is how images get made. So I've touched on a little bit of this already. What I'm describing is the real nature of light. So light is just part of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's the same stuff that radio is made of. It's the same stuff that microwaves are made of, or even gamma rays, right? They're actually all the electromagnetic spectrum. It's just that there's this actually quite narrow band of it that we think of as being a special thing, and we call it light. But that's us just being very human-centric, right? We call it light because we happen to have some sensors for it built into these holes that we have at the front, right? Whereas we don't have a built-in sensor for radio waves. We have to build those out of transistors and stuff and make radios. So that's it. The electromagnetic spectrum is this sort of continuous thing, and there's the visible to humans section is in here between the 400 and 700 nanometer wavelengths. And here we have the illusion of yellow, right, at 600. If you really had a 600 nanometer wave, that's like pure spectrum yellow light. But as I say, your eye doesn't actually detect that. Your eye simply, the yellow it tickles the red and the green parts enough that it creates the sensation that we think of as yellow. But we don't really know what yellow is. We don't know what anything is. It's all madness. Anyway, so that's light. And here's how the eye works. As you probably know that the eye has got... Do you know about rods and cones? Yeah, okay. Rods and cones. So you've got the cone sensors are the ones that can distinguish colour, and the rods just kind of do intensity. So the rods are like your night vision for just basic light gathering. But the cones they're described as being the red, green, and blue sensors. It turns out, if you actually look into the biology, it's a bit different. The so-called red cone, here's its response curve. Funnily enough, it actually peaks on yellow. But we call it the red one by, I guess, convention or by historical accident, because it's the only one that can actually detect red properly. Like it turns out it's not red's not its favourite colour, but the green and the blue ones can't really detect red nearly at all. Maybe the green one can a tiny bit. So the point is that if you actually expose some real red light to someone, your red cones would react to it to some degree, and the other ones really wouldn't. So that's why that gets called the red cone. The green cone is a bit more honestly named. It does indeed peak at green, although you can see that it is somewhat sensitive to blue and to orange as well. And then the so-called blue cone Assuming that my source is correct, which I think it is, the blue cone is actually most tuned to violet, but again, it's also it's the dominant one for blue. So that's just what's really going on. This is the thing that's of great interest to me, like this whole color illusion. The fact that we're creating like synthetic fake colors by sort of adding three colors together, but not really adding them, or just sort of shooting them at you simultaneously. It's the thing that I find of great interest. And this is how TVs work. This is why it's become possible to make TVs and screens, because our visual system is so primitive that really it's all just variations of three primaries. And it turns out, well, if you just have the hardware to build the three primaries, then by mixing those, you can make it look as if you can do the whole continuous spectrum, even though you actually can't. So it's very convenient that that limitation of our eye is what allows colour TV to exist. So what actually happens on modern TVs, like if you've got like an LCD panel, a lot of the modern ones, there's the way LCD panel works is there's a backlight that is basically supposed to be white light, and then it goes through the LCD part, which filters out certain parts of it. So the red part of an LCD screen is actually the part where the blue and the green got subtracted on the way through. So the red comes out the front. That's how it works. But it turns out if you actually look at the spectrum of the modern backlights, by the way, are based on an LED system. Sometimes it can be other things as well, but LEDs are kind of common now. And the thing is that the backlight has actually got this non-uniform distribution. The backlight is actually very blue, which is just for technology reasons, although it's got bits of the other colours in it. But what happens is you get this big backlight at the start, and then when it hits the LCD panel, that filters bits out. So your blue, the blue kind of phosphor, the equivalent of a phosphor on your panel, is responsive to this area of the curve, so it lets these parts of the light through. That's why it looks blue. The green one lets this part through, so it looks green, and the red one lets this part through, so it looks kind of red. And this is where you'll see that actually, if you think you see yellow on a screen, there's not much yellow, because the yellow from the backlight is this little section here, which is actually doesn't really pass through the green or the red filter very well. I mean, maybe a tiny bit, but not much. So it's sort of true what I say, that it's not really yellow light that's coming to you from a screen. It's generally going to be green light and red light that are coming through. But as I say, they create the kind of a fake sensation of yellow in your head. So it's not really yellow light. And as I've indicated, this is because this is a fact about humans. It's not a fact about the world. But humans, and I guess a fair number of other mammals, have got these this kind of trichromatic system where this is what these are the wavelengths that we respond to. But other creatures do it differently. It turns out the mantis shrimp has actually got 12 cones apparently, so it can identify meaningfully 12 different parts of the color spectrum, which would give a totally different sort of perceptual response to what humans have. In fact, mantis shrimp, has anyone seen this before? Okay, so the mantis shrimp's a fascinating little creature, and I think this thing about its colour vision is sufficiently almost relevant that I've persuaded myself it's worth showing it to you. So here we go, true facts about the mantis shrimp.
Here we will explore true facts about the mantis shrimp. The mantis shrimp is a living fossil of the prehistoric clown that all modern clowns evolved from. It is both beautiful and... Wait, is that a fishtail? What are you doing to that fish? The eyes of the mantis shrimp are among the most advanced eyes in the animal kingdom. These are very complicated eyes. Lots of tiny little eye parts moving in different directions. It's impossible to get a read on what these little bastards are thinking. Is it mad? No. Each of our human eyes creates a single picture, and the two together means that we have binocular vision. Each one of the mantis shrimp's eyes creates 3 separate images, a trinocular eyeball, and it has 2 of them, which means that it's sexnocular. Dirty science. Whoa, what was that? You can clean your eyeballs? That's crazy. Human eyes can detect 3 color wavelengths. The mantis shrimp can detect 5,400 of them. Just kidding. They can detect 12, 9 more than we can. But it's less impressive now, isn't it? Just 9, whatever. Imagine a color that you can't even imagine. Now do that 9 more times. That is how a mantis shrimp do. Oddly, the mantis shrimp is pretty bad at discerning the colors that humans can see, which is probably why it dresses like an idiot. And this explains the modern clown as well. And just like the modern clown, the mantis shrimp has a psychopathic killing instinct. Mantis shrimps are generally divided into 2 categories. The first, the spearers, have spiny barbed front scooping claws designed to snag and stab prey. The spearers play a version of hide-and-go-seek, which pretty much sucks for anyone that isn't hiding. Kind of a crappy game, really, not for kids. Alternatively, the smasher mantis shrimp have little Edward bowling ball hands that they use to punch the crap out of basically everything. They have the fastest punch in the world, with the same acceleration as a .22 caliber bullet. To a mantis shrimp, kung fu looks like tai chi. The mantis shrimp can deliver a blow with 1,500 newtons of force, which tells you what a sissy punch Newton must have had. That punch is so powerful that the universe can't even handle it. Water moves out of the way so fast that little vacuums are formed, called cavitation bubbles. These bubbles collapse immediately, and the force of that collapse creates a second shock wave, and even generates light and heat. That's some Mortal Kombat finishing move shit right there. Basically, it sucks to be the mantis shrimp's roommate. There's just way too much of the punching. Wait, did that guy just hand him his own arm? That's crazy. Have you ever heard the story of the hermit crab and the mantis shrimp? One day, that's it. That's the whole story. Even the octopus, who is quite a badass, can't deal with these little psycho bastards. If you're afraid of clowns, whoa, what the hell, man? Leave the crab alone. If you're afraid of clowns, stay afraid. Stay very afraid.
God damn it! The mantis shrimp there. But the relevant property of the mantis shrimp is because it's got like a real yellow detector. If you just shine red and green at a mantis shrimp, I'm assuming its brain will just say, well, that's just red and green at the same time. It won't have the same sensation as yellow would give it. And that is why you never see mantis shrimps watching television. It won't work for them. It'll look totally wrong. All right. Or playing computer games for the same reason. All right, so that's a little bit about colour theory. But the other thing that's relevant about colour for games rendering is the dynamic aspect, where we have the illusion of moving pictures, which is another trick that's not really happening. You probably know that already. I'm not the first one to break it to you. But the apparent moving pictures aren't really moving. It's just a bunch of still pictures being shown to you in rapid succession. And that's what games do too. And indeed, our rendering techniques would be limited if we couldn't do animation, and we'd just do animation by showing a succession of slightly different pictures, and your brain interprets it as things that were moving conveniently. Now, this section does have some historical stuff in it. A lot of what I'm doing here is I'm describing how old cathode ray tubes used to work, which I imagine that some of you are so young, I don't know, do you even remember having cathode ray tube TVs? You know, back when TVs were fat? Maybe when you were a kid, just a little bit. Even by then, I mean, the flat screens, I bought my first flat screen in 2002. In fact, I've still got it. So, yeah, but I was an early adopter, though. But back in 2002, most people still had fat TVs. And the fat part is there's a thing called a cathode ray tube inside it, which is how it all used to work. I'm explaining that because historically it's relevant to how graphics technology developed. And it turns out it's still relevant because modern displays are basically pretending to be cathode ray tubes. You know, they still scan the image from top to bottom, left to right. They don't actually need to anymore, but they do because all the precedents about how it's done were established back when we used cathode ray tubes. So it's going to seem a bit old-fashioned, but it's still sort of the truth. All right, so I imagine you have seen motion pictures. They've been around for quite a while. And as I say, that's just this, frames at a time. It's sometimes described as persistence of motion, but that's actually not supposed to be physically true anymore. Don't worry about that. So the way cinema works, or TV, or yes, also crappy cutscene games, is that the moving pictures that you see are, of course, pre-computed. In the case of film, they went out and filmed it one day. In the case of a CGI movie, they spent an hour rendering each frame. So they were all pre-computed and then shipped to you and then displayed to you very quickly. So that's how that kind of stuff works. In fact, it's all just an extension of the old flickbook principle. Do people still make flickbooks? Is this something you ever done it? Not really. You know what they are though? People know about flickbooks. So just a dumb animation of this is actually probably fake because it's an advert, but it shows you what a flickbook would sort of be like if you actually drew one. Also, ignore the apparent FPS thing. That's just marketing nonsense. I'm just doing it to show you what a flickbook animation sort of looks like. So of course the point here being that if you made a real flickbook, you actually drew one that we used to do in the old days, you would draw a separate picture, spend a couple of hours doing it, pre-prepare them all, and then you show it to someone by flicking the pages in front of them. So in the course of a second, you would flip through, a dozen pictures or something, and that's in a sense how all traditional animation systems work. And there's another one here. Again, both of these are, these weren't. I don't think these are real flickbooks. I think these have been, they've used computer technology to create fake flickbooks for advertising purposes, but it's kind of cute anyway. And part of the reason I mention all this is that when you're doing a computer game, though, you have to go one step ahead of all these things, right? A computer game is basically a flickbook that's being drawn in real time. It's being drawn while you're looking at it, right? So instead of you draw the pictures and then you go flip, right? Because you couldn't be interactive if you did that. To be interactive, what you need to do is you're showing them one picture and you're simultaneously drawing the next one down here and then showing it to them really quickly and then drawing the next one, showing it to them, and you're having to do that maybe 60 times a second or something. To create this real-time interactive flickbook, and that's what computer games are doing, which is unlike movies, which again they can pre-render it. That's why they look nicer. That's one of the reasons they look nicer. But games have got to actually generate the image within a 60th of a second, which is a really demanding task. Another old anyone know about Zoetropes? Ever seen a Zoetrope? It's just like another historical animation. The idea is it's a cylinder with some pictures on the inside, some holes that you look through. And the pictures of the different frames, and when you spin it, you see the animation. You can watch this if you like, but there's an even better one that I've got that Pixar made. So this is Pixar actually made a physical zoetrope where they used this idea of the an animation system that's based on having a spinning object, and you only look at it at the right time so that it's spinning in a pose that makes it look like it's animating. It's really cute, and I thought you might like to see it.
How animation works is it's a trick. When you go to a movie, you're basically seeing 24 still images every second. It's like a flip book. As I flip through here, you can see that each drawing is a little different than the last one. And then as I flip through at speed, the illusion of movement is created.
Pixar really wanted to show the public how animation works, and one of the ideas to do this was to build something called a zoetrope.
Zoetropes go back to the 19th century. If you imagine a barrel with little slots and images, each a little different from the last, it's like a shutter, and it shows you a little glimpse of that drawing across the way, and they appear to move. Studio Ghibli has this amazing three-dimensional zoetrope. John Lasseter had seen the zoetrope there, and I think he said, I've never seen an object that so well describes the basic premise of animation. When it was suggested...
So the point is that when it starts to look like it's animated, what's happening is the real thing's spinning very fast, but it's under a strobe light, and the strobe light is just going on, 30 times a second or something, and the strobe is timed to catch the thing when it's just at the right sort of viewpoint relative to its rate of spin, and that's why it suddenly starts to look like an animation.
So that we do one for ourselves, it was a no-brainer. Instead of drawings, we're using sculptures. So what you're seeing are 18 different sculptures, each slightly different than the last one. And instead of flipping through them, we're using a strobe light to make those images stick in your eye. And these spinning images freeze in space. And each sculpture replaces the last one and appears to move. It's stunning because it looks like it's come to life right in front of you.
I think that the zoetrope is the clearest explanation of animation, because on the disc, you get to see every frame of animation before your current frame where you're looking, and every frame of animation after it. Here you have the opportunity to see the tricks the animator used to make things move.
It's a very simple mechanism, it's a very simple idea, but somehow seeing that come to life right in front of you is really fantastic.
All right. Yes, let's say the trick is with the game, you're basically doing that kind of technique, but you're doing it in real time. You have to draw those images from scratch very quickly. You need to be fast to do that, but as luck would have it, partly thanks to Moore's law, computers today are fast, so we can draw, non-trivial images within a 60th of a second, fast enough that we can show them to you to get good-looking animation. This is why frame rate becomes an issue when you're making games. That's all about how long it's taking you to draw the pictures behind the scenes, basically. So nowadays, you'll often hear people wanting games to run at 60 FPS, because that kind of looks good, and a lot of screens refresh at 60 FPS nowadays or higher. That wasn't always the case. In fact, sometimes it's still the case that some games run at 30 FPS, especially if they're like in busy scenes when there's a lot going on. It turns out the computer's kind of scribbling away drawing the picture, and it can't get it done in a 60th of a second. So it takes a little bit longer. But because the display device only works in units of 60th of a second, even if you're only a little bit late, you now have to wait for the next bus to come. So you drop down to 30 frames a second, and you might sometimes notice that when games get kind of a bit sluggish, if there's a lot going on. That's what's happening there. So remember, each one of these frames that we're drawing on modern systems, if you've got more than 1,000 pixels across, which you typically do, you've got millions of pixels per image, and you maybe got 60 images per second. And if you're trying to do it in VR, you've got twice as many because you're doing one for each eye. So there's like a huge amount of stuff needs to get, a lot of pixels need to get drawn. A lot of dots have to get calculated. So I go back far enough that when I started making games as a kid in the 80s, the output device would be a standard domestic TV, and these were cathode ray tube based. And they would mostly be displaying either 25 or 30 images a second. That's the way old TV standards used to work. Partly compromises based around the fact that film was made at 24 frames a second in the old days, and a lot of it still will be, although sometimes you get higher rates in films as well. like The Hobbit, filmed at 48 FPS, and nobody liked it. People seem to prefer the look of 24 FPS. So there was no point in a game having a frame rate like higher than 30 FPS back in the day, because your TV really only had 30 FPS, unless you get into interlacing, which I'm not going to. And this is how it actually worked. So the way the cathode ray tube would work is there's an electron beam inside it, and it's controlled by magnets on the side that can pull the beam left, right, up and down. And the idea is that the beam would be set up to be pulled left to right, top to bottom down the screen, and these electrons would hit the phosphors at the front of the television, and the phosphors would glow when the electrons hit them. And depending on the strength of the signal, they glow by different amounts, and that's how you would get the image built up. This is sort of what it looks like inside a CRT. You've got the tube part here, the magnets that are steering it, and then the bit at the front with the phosphors. And the phosphors on a colour set would exist in 3 different types, red, green and blue, and there's a clever trick thing called a shadow mask that's used to basically allow separate guns for the separate colours, so you could get colour separation. Anyway, that's how it all used to work. If you look at it from the side, this is what's happening is you've got a cathode, remember that? A cathode being heated up here, emitting a bunch of electrons, being bent by electromagnets, hitting the screen and giving off some light, and that's how it all worked. So I will talk a bit more about that on Wednesday. We're nearly finished, but not quite, because there's more about this, how it relates to things that you might see in games, including things like screen tearing that you've maybe encountered. But before we go to that, I'll just show you this little music video that shows just some old archive footage of old TVs being constructed, including things like how they would test them by putting like a big hooked magnet in front of the TV to make sure the magnet was bending the beam. And it's just a cute little bit of nostalgia for the day when cathode ray tubes ruled the world.
Color. Red, blue. Orange, violet. Green, blue, red, blue. Gray, blue, black. Yellow, blue, green, turquoise, white. The world of color. Color, the touchstone of reality. Color to excite the mind. The vivid, pulsating miracle that gives substance to shadow. One of the outstanding scientific and artistic triumphs of the 20th century. Now there is color everywhere. Color within the reach of everyone. With a suddenness that rocked the civilized world. The entire world will stream into our living rooms with the velocity of light. Spectacular.
I believe in this world to come. I think it's going to be a pretty good world.
Who knows what miracles are yet to come? A bright new era dawning.
Right, that's it for today. I'll pick it up on Wednesday.